Hi everyone, I'm Natasha with Fit Mama Santa Barbara, and today we're talking about glute amnesia. Now, what is this? It's essentially when your glutes turn off, and it's becoming more and more common the more that people are sitting and are not active throughout the day. I also see it a lot with my clients since I work a lot with women after pregnancy. During pregnancy, our glutes don't like to work. This has a lot to do with the posture we're standing in and the way that we're moving our body. And so this is something that is really important to pay attention to after having a baby so that you can get back to doing all the things you want to do and you're not going to be putting yourself at risk of injury and problems further down the line. So let's get started. Today we're going to talk about how to test for glute weakness, how to treat it, and I'm going to give you some exercises that you can do at home to help rehab your glutes and get them back to firing the way that they should. So when it comes to testing our glute strength, the first thing I want you to do is set yourself up in front of a mirror or in front of your camera and take a little video. I want you to look at the side profile. So looking on one side, I put my hands here so that I know I'm in a nice neutral spine because we can easily make our butt look bigger by sticking it out. So putting your hands in front of you, nice neutral pelvis here, looking at one side. You can look at the back angle, look at the other side. So when you look at this, I want you to pay attention to the slight differences from side to side. So a lot of times people will be more developed on one side. That can tell us that that side is doing more work and maybe compensating for the weak glute on the other side. You can maybe see that one side may stick out more than the other, or looking at hamstring definition, so that connection between your hamstring and your glute. You can usually tell if you have more tone on one side, more definition. So before you even go with doing any sort of test, just look at your glutes. A lot of times, I have a pretty trained eye, I've been doing this for a while. I can look at someone and visibly identify what muscles they need to work on because they're that deconditioned. Now, moving on to testing our glutes. So the way we're gonna test this is I want you to lie on your belly. And with this, we're looking at the action between the glutes and the hamstrings. So a lot of people like to use their hamstrings to compensate for their weak glutes. It's very important that when we're doing our daily activities, our glutes are firing before our hamstrings so that the hamstrings aren't doing all the work. So very simple exercise here. You're going to lie on your belly and put your hands on your hamstrings. So I'm feeling for that muscle bulk in the back of my legs. Now from here, I want you to simply squeeze your glutes. So I'm squeezing my butt. I'm really trying to feel it right here. I'm visualizing those muscles working. Now when I do that, you want to see if you can feel your hamstrings popping up into the back of your hands. Now, if I do that and I automatically feel that muscle firing, my hamstring muscle here, that tells me that my glutes probably are not working very much. So trying that again, trying to be more mindful, I want you to just squeeze, 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 and see if you can feel your glutes while your hamstrings remain soft. Now to feel the difference here, I want you to keep your hands where they are. I want you to squeeze your glutes, so squeeze, 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 and then lift up the leg. So as you lift the leg, we need our hamstrings as an accessory muscle to extend through the hip. So, like I said, you want to feel the glutes firing first and your hamstrings firing second. Now, we're going to move on to the single leg squat test. This is another test that you can do. Really good to do it in front of the mirror so you can see how your body is functioning when you do a single leg squat. This is a very telling test when it comes to identifying where people are weak. So pretty simple. You can stand against a wall if you need to for balance, or you can just stand in front of a mirror or take a video of yourself. You're going to kick one leg up behind you. Now when you do this, I'm going to face you so you can see what I'm looking for here. So when you do this, you're going to squat down with that one leg and then bring it back up. So what I'm looking for is if this hip is falling out to the side. So a lot of times people will squat like this. So you'll notice when I do this hip is going out and this knee is going in. So what that's telling me is that they're pretty weak through their outer hip there, and they're not able to stabilize and sink back, keeping everything in one line. The other thing you want to look for is where the waistband of their pants is. So you notice when I squat down, I'm doing a pretty good job at keeping my waistband fairly level, but if people are dumping into that weak hip, they will hike up this way. Sometimes they will even fall back this way. That's actually very hard for me to do. So do that on both sides so you can see even on myself. This side, if I keep my core tight, I'm keeping that nice neutral spine. I can sink back pretty good. You can look at your foot too. If people are rocking into the inside of their foot, they're caving in their arches, rocking to the outside. Now, if I do that on the other side, I know this leg is a little bit weaker. So you can see a little bit more instability there when I do that. I'm kind of losing it a little bit in my hip, so really focusing on trying to keep that hip tucked in, using those glute muscles, and using my core and everything else to stabilize my pelvis. So try that, take a video of yourself, slow it down into slow motion, gives you some really good indicators on what you should be looking for. So another exercise that you can do to test your glute med strength, so the glutes on the outside of your bottom, is a side lying muscle test. So this is something that I would typically do to my clients, but you can also kind of modify it a bit and do it to yourself. So lying on your side, you can put your head in your hand or you can put your head on a pillow. You want to bring yourself with your knees bent in that clamshell position. So I have one hip stacked right on top of the other, and then I'm going to bring this leg up. Now take your floating hand here, put it on the outside of your leg, and I want you to push into your hand for a count of 5. Now when you do this, I want you to pay attention to where you feel it. So you should be shaking a little bit. Are you feeling it in your glute? Are you feeling it in your hip flexor? Are you feeling it in your core? Are you feeling it in your back? Okay, so a lot of times when people are weak through their glute, they don't have a whole lot of strength here. I can almost push them down with my hand when I'm working on them. And I can see the muscles of their back popping out. I can see their hip flexor popping out. So that tells me that they're trying to use all those other muscles to compensate for that weak glute. Now, you also want to test it on the other side. So like I said, you want to make sure one side is not stronger than the other. So stacking the hips right on top of each other, bringing that leg up, bringing your hand here, pushing out. This side is way better for me. I can feel my glute and I'm not really seeing those compensatory patterns that I see on the other side. So give that a try and take a note of what side feels better. Okay, so maybe you identified that both your glutes are weak, maybe one side is weak, maybe one side just is not firing the way that it should. So we're going to talk about how you can treat this. So really, I like to go through 3 major steps. The first thing that we're going to want to do is that we're going to want to loosen overactive muscles. So a lot of times people's TFL, which is the muscle that if you put your hand in your pocket, that's where that muscle is, right? So a lot of times that muscle will kick in to try to stabilize the pelvis and do the work for the glutes. Even though it's a very small muscle, it should not be doing that much work. So that can be really tight on people and that can interfere with their glutes firing. Like I mentioned earlier, your hamstrings, so the muscles on the back of your legs, people have such tight hamstrings. I have seen so many clients that are able to do a lot of things, but they can barely touch their toes. So if our hamstrings are chronically tight, that usually means that they're being overworked. So we need to work on loosening those up and getting those a little less inhibited so that our glutes can start doing the work. Now, the second step with all of this, first we loosen the muscles, then we lengthen them. So lengthening through stretching. Usually I do some active or passive stretches with people. And then once those muscles are inhibited and lengthened, we can move on to the glute exercises. So when our muscles are tight, it's very hard to try to target a different muscle area when they're trying to take over and do all the work. So it's super important that you guys are warming up and doing these things before you try to do the glute activation work. Now, when it comes to glute activation, there's a ton of exercises that we can do, and it's really important to pick exercises that are at your level. If you are struggling through an exercise and all those other muscles are kicking in to compensate, it's not helpful. All you are doing is retraining the wrong way of doing things. So when we're doing these, I want you to really think about keeping your TFL nice and loose and squishy, not letting the hamstrings kick in to do things, and really just focusing on feeling it in the glute. Even if you have to start super small, so we're talking about just lying down, squeezing your glutes, trying to find that movement, that is better than trying to do a harder exercise and doing it wrong. So let's get started. We're going to go through how to loosen up your muscles and how to lengthen them and then move on to our exercises. So when it comes to inhibiting overactive muscles, what you want to think about is that if you overstimulate that muscle, eventually it's going to let go. So that's kind of the premise behind deep tissue massage and PNF stretching. So I'm going to show you a few of the tools that I use to kind of overstimulate those muscles prior to my workout so that the other muscles, like the glutes, can do the work that they're supposed to do. So the first thing I have here is a Hypervolt. So this is a massage gun. I know not everyone has one of these at home, but if you have the luxury of having one, please use it. It is awesome, super great to use before your workouts, after your workouts. I like to use this especially on areas like my TFL. That's one of my problem areas right now. It's been kind of acting up on me and been really tight and annoying. Very common with runners. So if you're running and you're not running with great form, a lot of times we can be using that TFL muscle instead of our glutes. So I turn the massage gun here. I have it on a low setting so I'm not jumping off of the ground because this can get pretty tender, but I'm working through the top of that glute area, wrapping it around to my hip flexors, getting through that crease, working down the quad. So this is what I would do before I'm going to do my glute activation exercises. You can also use it for the back of the hamstrings, so working through the back of the leg, finding those areas that are particularly tight and sticky. That's kind of what you want to focus on. So that's how you would use the massage gun. If you do not have one of those at home, you may have a ball. So you can use a massage ball or a lacrosse ball. This is really great for using against a wall. So I'm going to show you how I roll out my TFL on the wall. So putting the ball between my glute and the wall, I'm rolling through here. So once again, trying to figure out those sticky spots, really working out those little knots. You can also use it on the piriformis, so right on the back of the glute. There's usually, you can feel that tight area there. A lot of people can do this for their hip flexors. So lying on the ground, putting that under your hip flexor, really rolling through that. That is very intense on this side. So if you have tight hip flexors, definitely try this. This is a good one to kind of loosen things up a little bit. And yeah, that's how you would use the massage ball. So play with that. Last thing is a foam roller. If you do not have a foam roller at home, I would recommend getting one. They're like 20 bucks and I use mine all the time. So once again, we're using it very similar to the ball. So we can use that on our IT band. So on the side of our leg here, rolling up and down. Once again, you can roll onto that glute, try to find those tight, sticky areas. You can also use this for the hamstring, so the back of the leg. So we're rolling out that hamstring, rolling over that bulky muscle kind of in the center, working on that hamstring glute connection. So yeah, you get the point. That's how we would use our tools so that we can loosen everything up and try to inhibit these muscles before we start doing our exercises. So let's move on to how to lengthen the muscles. So you can do dynamic stretches where you're moving through the motion. You can do static stretches. I find that if you're going to be going into a glute exercise, so something like hip thrusts or glute bridges, super important to stretch your hamstrings and your hip flexors first. So once again, this gives those muscles a bit of length so that your glutes can do the work and your tight, contracted hamstrings aren't just trying to kick in and do more. We don't want to be training movement patterns that are not optimal. So I'm sure most of you have learned how to stretch your hamstrings before, but I'll show you a few little basic exercises here. So lying down, we want to bring one leg up. You can pull that leg towards you, so we should feel that on the back of the leg. It's a great stretch. You want to hold your stretches for 20-30 seconds here. Another one that I like is crossing into that figure four. So this is getting more the outside of the hip and the glute, bringing that bottom leg towards you. I'm using my elbow to push out on that top knee. And then once again, our hip flexors, so a great hip flexor stretch. We're coming up into a half kneeling position, leaning forward, stretching out that hip flexor. So I'm really feeling this through the front of the leg. And once again, you want to hold your stretches for 20-30 seconds, really letting that muscle kind of decompress here. Sometimes you need to stretch multiple times before each set of exercise. So I find if my hamstrings are particularly tight and I'm doing multiple sets of hip thrusts with a barbell or on the ground, I actually like to stretch my hamstrings in between every set because it doesn't take much for those to want to take over and start getting tight. And then, like I said, that's when your glutes turn off. So First we loosen up, then we lengthen. Now we're going to move into how to activate the glutes. So the first thing we want to focus on is simply finding your glutes. Now I find, especially for my women after pregnancy, just these simple exercises can be really hard because it's been a long time since our glutes have had to do any work. During pregnancy, we like to stand in that anterior pelvic tilt, so sticking out our belly, that completely turns our glutes off. So I'm going to give you an example of that. So lying on your belly here, I want you to think about arching your back. So we're kind of tilting our hips, we're arching through our back. You can see there's that sway back in my low back. Now try to contract your glutes. You can feel that it's actually really hard to squeeze your glutes when you're arched through your back like that. Now I want you to tilt your pelvis a little bit, bring it more into a neutral. So think about scooping your pelvic bone under. Now squeeze your glutes. From there, I can get so much more glute contraction. So my glutes are actually firing the way they should. Now think about how we're doing that all day, every day when we're pregnant. So if we're constantly standing in that anterior to pelvic tilt position, those glutes are in a lengthened position and completely turned off. So really important to rehab that, guys. So this brings me to our first exercise. This is simply all I want you to do. So you can lie on your stomach, you can put your head on a pillow or a block or something, whatever's comfortable. I like to put mine actually just in my hands. And working on keeping those hamstrings nice and loose. So I shake them out a bit. We already did our loosening and our lengthening. And now we're squeezing our glutes. So squeeze, 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 and relax. Once again, we're going to squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. I want you to do this like 5 times. Hold it for a set of 3 counts every time you squeeze. We can add in that leg extension. So hand on your hamstrings, squeeze the glute first, lifting up the leg, bringing it back down. And I can feel kind of on my forearm here, my glute is squeezing, then my hamstring squeezing as I lift. So work through that, do a set of like 5 or 10 on each side. And then you're ready to move on to the next exercise. So if you're feeling your glutes, you're like, okay, my glutes are firing, my hamstrings aren't taking over, I can step it up and do the next thing here. So if you're weaker on one side than you are on the other side, I'm gonna give you a little tip that's gonna help you activate that weak side when we're doing double leg exercises. So if you have a weight, dumbbell, whatever you have at home, I want you to hold that on the side that is weak. So I'm gonna come into side high kneeling position here. Now when I do this, now it is very natural for me to want to just stand like this. I have that sway in my back, that anterior pelvic tilt, and that seems very normal to me. I was a ballet dancer most of my life, and so a lot of it comes from that. So before I even start, I want to think about tucking my pelvis under a little bit. So I'm using my low abs to hold that neutral spine, okay? Now from here, I'm holding that weight on the side that is weak. So my right side is my weaker glute. And I want to keep that neutral spine, nice flat back, as I sink back into a hinge position and then coming up, squeezing my glutes at the top. So as I do this, I'm really sinking back and then squeezing my glutes at the top. Now, another tip here, if you find that you're still having a hard time finding your glutes, you can try putting a block between your knees. That's going to force you to use your adductors, so your inner thigh muscles, coming down into our hinge, squeezing in, squeezing the butt. I find when I do that, I can also get a much better glute contraction because I'm not using the other muscles to compensate as much. So try those. Make sure that you're feeling that in your glutes and nowhere else. So you should not be feeling that in the hamstrings or in your low back. And this is something that you can do maybe 3 sets of 10. And if that feels good, you can move on to the next exercise. Our next exercise is meant to target the glute med. This is what I find gets really weak on people. This is kind of the muscle on the outside of your glute. So when you see all those exercises online that are like, build your glutes, a lot of them work on your glute med. So what we're going to do is we're going to come into a side lying position, and I'm going to tell you all the ways that people usually cheat on this. So I'm sure you've seen these before, up and down with the leg. Now, a lot of times when we do this, people like to use their hip flexors or using their TFL to do all the work, and your glute is not even working at all. So I want you to put your hand on here. If you feel that muscle popping into your hand the moment you lift your legs, you're gonna have to modify this, okay? So one way to think about it is you can bring your leg behind your body a little bit. So I'm bringing that leg into extension. I'm also making sure that my hips are stacked one on top of each other. So this hip is right over this bottom hip. I'm bringing that leg back, not much, maybe like 6 inches. I can already feel my glute having to fire to hold my leg here. So once again, thinking about not using that TFL, bringing that leg up and down. Oh, I can feel that so much more in my glute and not in my hip flexor. If that still is not working for you and you're having a hard time just using that glute and not overcompensating, think about turning your leg in. So we're turning our leg in. I'm pointing my toes slightly down and I'm bringing it a little bit behind me. I'm thinking about keeping my core engaged. So we don't want to be sucking in here, but we want some sort of engagement because that's going to help stabilize through the pelvis. Once again, we don't want our low back and our paraspinals to be kicking in. So that's another way that people cheat, is that in order to get glute activation, they arch through their low back. So we don't want those muscles to be working. So we're using our core to help inhibit those muscles on the back. So keeping my core tight, turning that foot in, raising it up and down. This I am definitely feeling in my glute. So when we turn our foot in, that keeps our TFL busy. So that is the motion that our TFL does. So if it is busy keeping your foot turned in, it's not going to be working for your glutes, okay? So once again, you can do like 3 sets of 10 on each side of these. And if these feel good, you can feel that burn in your glute, you can move on to the next exercise. So speaking of glute med, we are going to use a band for our bridges here. So the band puts extra pressure on, makes us press out into our legs, which is going to activate that glute med. Once again, you want to make sure that your glutes are working during bridges and you're not just extending through your back or using your hamstrings to do all the work. So lying on the ground here, I'm going to bring my hands about hip width apart. And I usually touch like right at the end of my fingertips. That's where you want your heels to be. So I'm looking at my legs here. My knees are right in line with my hips. My hands are by my side. Before I start, I'm getting into that neutral spine position, so you don't want to be arched up like this. If you're doing your bridges like this, guess who's doing the work? Not your glutes. So we want to tuck our pelvis under just a little bit, putting that pressure out on the band, so that's going to start waking up our glute med so that they're doing the work here. And we're just going to raise it up and bring it back down. So once again, I'm trying to hold that pelvis position. I'm not arching up too much at the top. And I'm bringing it back down. You should not be feeling this too much in the hamstrings. So we want to keep this just in the glutes. And same thing, we don't want to be using our quads to do this. So a major complaint that I get from a lot of my clients is they're like, oh, my quads burn when I'm doing my glute bridges. So in order to rectify that, I find the band does help because that makes us use our glute med. You can think about where you're putting the pressure through your feet. So play around with it. So sometimes people find that they can find their glutes more if they're pressing right through their heels. Sometimes they need to shift their weight into the front of their foot a little bit. So for me, I find if I shift my weight so that I am pushing through all 4 corners of my feet, I get a little bit more glute activation there. I'm not using my quads as much. Some people though, like I said, they kind of have to lift their toes, and that's the only way that they're getting that posterior chain activation. So work through that with the band. You may find that you use one side more than the other, and that is when we want to move into our single leg bridges. I love single leg work if we're trying to balance out one side with the other. I find everybody is imbalanced. Humans are made to be symmetrical, but somehow it does not work that way. So a lot of times people will have one side that's weaker, and the problem with having a weaker side is that the other side likes to always do the work. So when we're doing exercises like the bridges that we just did, my left side wants to do all the work and my right side is just coming along for the ride. So that's when we work in some single leg work. But the caveat here is that the single leg work can be really hard. So a lot of times if you're trying to use those muscles that aren't used to doing very much work, they fatigue really quickly. So don't be ashamed if you need to modify these exercises down and just get to the point where you can feel the right muscles working and everything else is not kicking in to compensate, okay? So lying on your back, we're going to go into our single leg glute bridges. I'm going to do them on this side because that is my stronger leg. So lying here, I'm going to bring one leg up. You can bring it up to 90 degrees. Another tip too is you can bring that knee to your chest. That puts us in a bit of our posterior tilt. So once again, we can't cheat by arching our back. So we're gonna hold this here, bringing that other leg up, and then bringing it down. So when you do this, you wanna think that your knee is staying right over your hip, so you're not letting that knee flare out. And we're using the stability of our inner thighs, the movement of our glutes, and using those glute meads that we worked on in our last set of exercises. And I'm really just focusing on visualizing my glutes doing the work here. Now, if that is too hard and you're having a hard time getting up, so a lot of times if your hip flexors are super tight, I have some clients that can barely get any higher than this, okay? So if that is feeling hard for you, take a block or something that you can put your foot on and place your other foot on the block. So I'm gonna I will switch this here so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm putting my foot on the block. Now I'm still thinking about working with my leg that is not on the block. The block is simply for a little bit of extra assistance, okay? So like I said, if you need to modify this down, totally fine, but just modify it correctly so that you're not using all your other muscles instead. So keeping this foot lightly on the block and keeping most of my weight into my working leg. Lifting up, same thing, thinking about not arching through my back and using my breath here, okay? So you always want to be breathing out at the hardest part of the motion. So I'm breathing in, engaging my core, lifting up, breathing out. So when I do this, I definitely feel my leg that is not on the block working harder, and that's what you want to focus on. The other leg is just there for a little bit of balance, a little bit of support, so you're not using that to do the movement so much. Now we're going into our hip thrusts. Now these are probably the best exercise you can do if you want to be building your glutes at the gym. So a lot of times I'll do this with a barbell across my hips or maybe on the Smith rack machine, but I'm going to show you how to do them at home. So we're using a chair for this, and we're going to start with doing them with no weight, because once again, we want to make sure that we're getting this movement right, because if you're adding weight and you're only compensating with your other muscles, it's not going to help you, okay? So we're going to come against a chair here. You want to bring your upper back up on the chair. So we're propping ourselves up into this bridge position. Now, if you're on a bench, you can hold like the bar, you can hold the bench, whatever feels good. But for at home, I'm going to put my hands on my hips. That's going to make sure I'm keeping my hips level. You don't want to be tilting one way or tilting the other way. So from here, same thing. We're not arching through the back. We're keeping that nice neutral spine. I'm dipping myself down, squeezing my glutes at the top. Once again, we don't want those other muscles kicking in. So a lot of times you can put your hands like on your TFLs here, and if you start to feel those really engaging, you know that you need to switch things up a little bit. So I'm working through those hip thrusts. You can do like 3 sets of 10 here. I want you to squeeze for a minute at the top, or for a second, not a minute. I want you to squeeze for a second at the top, okay? So we're really using that squeeze, using that activation, and then loosening completely as we come down. So muscles are only good if they're able to relax and contract. So make sure that you're relaxing your glutes on the way down and then squeezing on the way up. This is also really good for working the pelvic floor. So when we're doing any of these glute exercises, we're having to use our pelvic floor strength as well. So great for our women postpartum. Now, some variations on that. You can add a band. So doing these with a band, like I said, gets you a little bit more of that glute med activation. You can do these with one leg, which once again, I find it to be really good for those people who are uneven, but it can be pretty challenging. So if I'm coming into those single leg glute raises, so say I'm gonna do this side, I'm coming down, bringing it up, really thinking about keeping that core engaged. My hips are level, bringing it down and up. Now that's pretty hard for me on my weaker leg. So I'm gonna show you a little modification here. So if my right side is weaker, my left side is gonna go on you can use a bench or a block or whatever you have. I'm bringing it down, squeezing up at the top, really trying to get that full extension with my hip. So this hip flexor is trying to stop me from getting to the top, but I really wanna stretch through it there. And I'm using my glutes. I'm really squeezing through those glutes, pushing through my heels so that my glutes are working and it's not just all hamstrings. Okay, one more exercise for you. These are really good as a warm-up or to do before you go into doing your squats or deadlifts or whatever you're doing. So we're gonna put that band right above our knees. They're called monster walks. Bring your hips, your feet to hip width apart, and you're gonna walk forward, keeping that nice hinge position using our glutes, okay? So I'm really pushing out on the band here and then walking back. I find if you are TFL dominant, so if you like to use your hip flexors to do things, you will feel that as you're walking forward. A good way to counteract that is to walk backwards. So when I walk backwards, I can really focus on getting those glutes to work. And then same thing, if you are hamstring dominant and you don't like to use your glute meads, try doing that sideways. So once again, I'm keeping that bend in my knees, really activating the outer glutes. Going back the other way, keeping that core tight so I'm not arching through my back, cheating my way through this. And there you go. So give that a try. You can do 3 sets of 10. Once again, really great as a warm-up. So just to wrap up here, I threw a lot at you today. I'm sure that if you went through all those exercises, you can start to feel what muscles are working, what muscles aren't working. So just to recap, when it comes to using props and tools, the band, so putting a band around your knees will always help you activate your glute med, so the glute muscles on the side of your bottom. That's a good one for people who just have a really weak glute med. So when they do those hip raises, they have a really hard time doing that. The block, so the block is awesome for putting between your knees if you need to get some more adductor activation. So like I said, if you are having a hard time finding your glutes, sometimes it can be that you have really weak adductors. So putting the block between your knees, we're activating our adductors, and that allows our glutes to fire a little bit better because it's giving us the stability through our pelvis so that the glutes can actually work the way that they want to, and you're not just compensating by using your hamstrings and your hip flexors. The last thing that we talked about today is using a weight. So if you have one side that is weaker than the other, you can hold the weight at your shoulder while you're doing squats, while you're doing those glute raises. If you're lying on your back in the glute bridges, you can hold the weight straight over your head. So holding that over your head, once again, that's just gonna bring that awareness to that side of the body. So those muscles are gonna be more likely to fire. Now, I hope you learned something today. If you're interested in working on your glutes and working through some maladaptive movement patterns, please send me a message. I am taking one-on-one online clients right now, and we can help you get your glutes a little bit stronger.